Well, I want to welcome everybody to our coordinators meeting. I did remember to just hit the record button, so that's a good thing. It's an easy thing to forget sometimes, but welcome to you and thanks for being here today. I think we will go ahead and get started. I'm looking at our agenda. Hopefully you had a chance to look through our topics today. I feel like we have a pretty packed agenda. So why don't we just kind of jump in and get started, and we'll get as far as we can. Lots of good information and sharing today. So I'm going to first up we have Karen and Jenna, and I see you're on there, are going to be sharing with us on the topic of dyslexia, a very big topic statewide, the impact of the conception of dyslexia on the SDI reading support that we provide to our students. And I would just like to turn it over to you guys to share with us. And I'm assuming if I stop sharing and turn the screen over to you guys, will that be the most helpful?
Yes, we would like to be able to share our screen if possible.
You bet. There we go.
Okay, so are you ready for us, Ron?
Yes, please.
Okay. I didn't know if that was all your opening comments. Okay, so
the people who weren't on earlier, happy Valentine's Day. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you, Sherry. Okay, sorry, we're having a little technical difficulties here trying to figure out how to share our screen.
Okay, go to Reading Advanced Zoom.
Okay, I think we got it. Slide deck is also attached or linked to the agenda, so you should be able to click on that and see the slide deck. We've put together just a few slides. We have about 20 minutes this morning, so this is going to be a pretty brief overview, but we're hoping that the resources we share will be beneficial to you. We get a lot of questions out in the schools about dyslexia specifically, as maybe parents come forward with questions or teachers have questions. So we're hoping to be able to share some resources that may give you a place to go if you have a parent or a teacher that has concerns about a student around dyslexia. So the first thing we wanted to share is just a definition of dyslexia. So dyslexia is defined in Iowa Code, and you can see it on our second slide there. It's defined as a specific and significant impairment in the development of reading, including but not limited to phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, not solely accounted for by intellectual ability, sensory disability, or impairment or lack of appropriate instruction. So if the reason for a student struggles are those things, then we wouldn't consider it dyslexia. But when we're looking at students with dyslexia, what we often see are the phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency issues, and then we can also see vocabulary and comprehension issues as a result of the fact that they struggle with those other things. What you may see when you have a parent that maybe has taken their child to an outside evaluator and gotten a diagnosis of dyslexia, they have probably used the DSM-5, which is the manual that an outside evaluator would probably use to determine if the student met the criteria for the term dyslexia. So that was revised a few years back, and one of the, I guess, points of controversy around that revision was that did they take the term, was the term dyslexia included? And if you ever get a report back from an outside agency, it will probably say specific learning disability, which is the term used in the DSM-5, but they can also code it as with impairment in reading, and they do have the option of using the term dyslexia. So the term dyslexia it's used outside of school, but it's also written in our federal guidelines for special education. So because we are a non-categorical categorical state, we don't necessarily use that term or provide that diagnosis because we are non-categorical. We don't label any disability, but it is a term that, it is an educational term that can be used both inside and outside of school. We'll get a little bit more into that as we go through these slides and explain that a little bit more. We did want to share with you, Iowa does have 3 dyslexia laws on the books. There's a link there to that Iowa dyslexia laws slide. It takes you to the Decoding Dyslexia website. So if we click on that, I will just show you. This is a nice resource. The Decoding Dyslexia Iowa is an organization within Iowa that does a lot of work, advocacy work around dyslexia, but they also do a lot of education. They put on a conference every year. So they have a page that kind of talks about the Iowa dyslexia laws. The first one was signed in 2014, and so that's where that definition came from that I showed you earlier. They've also done some work to get more requirements in teacher preparation programs so that we help our teachers become more aware of dyslexia. And then the most recent was in last April, a dyslexia task force was formed, and that's a state-level task force made up of AEA representation, Department of Ed, there's folks from Decoding Dyslexia Iowa, and they have been meeting since this law was put into place, and they are to put out a report in November of this year with some of the things that they have been looking at. So part of what they're looking at is some education for pre-service teachers, some of those requirements, what do we want to make sure teachers know as they're training about dyslexia. They're putting together some information about assessments, technology. So they're covering a lot of different things. That task group is looking at a lot of different things in relation to dyslexia, and they'll be, as I said, one of their task is to come out with a report in November. So we may see some new information coming down the pike as that group does its work. Take us back here to, there we go. So that's kind of the dyslexia laws that are on the books in Iowa. Just so you're aware, we do have some guidelines, and those have, since 2014, have really lent itself to coming out with some more resources for educators in the area of dyslexia. So before we dive into those, we're just going to look a little bit more at kind of what is dyslexia, because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings out there about what exactly it is, and how do we recognize it? Do we respond to that in the school setting?
All right, good morning, Jenna here. So if you go on the next slide, we're on slide 5, and this is the simple view of reading. If you have not seen this before, we're just going to go through this, but we talk about this a lot with many of the courses that we teach with teachers and administrators here in the agency. So this is, you can see at the top, it says reading is the product of decoding, which is the ability to read words on a page, and language comprehension, which is the understanding of those words. So if you look there at the top, there's those 2 domains of printed word recognition, which is decoding, times the language comprehension. And so if you think about it as a simple math problem, if you don't have printed word recognition, that's a 0, but you have language comprehension, you're still not going to have your full reading, okay? Or vice versa, you have language, if you don't have language comprehension, but you have printed word recognition, again, you're not going to be able to be a consolidated reader. So to go in further into the printed word recognition, what we're talking about there are the phonemic awareness and phonics, and then fluency bridges between the printed word rec and language comprehension. And fluency is more than just being able to read, quickly on a page. We're looking at fluency at the sound level, the word level, phrases, sentence level, and also more than just rate. Accuracy is number 1. We have to be accurate in those pieces before we can look at rate. And then we are also looking at expression and prosody as we're reading. Then when you move into the language comprehension piece, that's where we have vocabulary, their background knowledge, and then reading comprehension. So you can see it includes the 5 components of reading there. And when those are all together, that's when we have consolidated reader. And we have used a lot of work from David Kilpatrick. So one of the resources we'll reference is the essentials of assessing, preventing, and overcoming reading difficulties. And so in that simple view, we're just thinking that the dyslexic person has adequate language comprehension, but poor word reading skills. So it is a phonological processing issue. So if you look on the side with printed word recognition, that is where kids or anyone with dyslexia is struggling. And so that's a lot of times where we really need to pinpoint that instruction. And so once they're given a screener as FAST or AIMS-UP, whatever it is, then we need to dig into, is it phonological awareness? We need to give another diagnostic for that, and also for decoding before we can even begin to look at fluency. So we just really have to make sure we're not just using the screening data to decide our instruction. The screening is telling us who is at risk, but then we need to dig into diagnostic data to help us with that. So I think the biggest thing that we've encountered is that dyslexia is not visual. It is not visual. It is a phonological processing issue. So I know we hear a lot, well, they have B&D reversals. That is not a symptom of dyslexia. That is showing us that that child is in that phase of development in their reading. So that's very common and developmentally appropriate for kids up through about age 8. And so if we have 12, 14-year-olds still doing that, that's because they're still in that phase of their reading. Okay. Oh, yep. And then this is a quote from David Kilpatrick that simply defined, dyslexia refers to difficulty in developing word-level reading skills despite adequate instructional opportunities. That is much less intriguing than the popular discourse about dyslexia, which often focuses on the reversals and transposition of letters. However, those are not defining characteristics, nor do they have anything to do with visual processing. Okay, and then if you move into slide 6, this is again from Kilpatrick, the different types of reading difficulties. And sometimes it's nice just to kind of see this, and I know you can kind of think of students that would fall into place in each of these categories. So if you start in the top left, we have a strong word reader and a strong language comprehender. So they're your typical reader. And then if you move down there, this is where we have a dyslexic or a compensator. They're weak in the word reading, but strong in language comprehension. And when you hear compensator, that's because kids have developed ways to compensate, to hide, and to cover up to get through. So they may have a lot of accuracy mistakes. They may just kind of mumble through, but they have enough background knowledge to be able to answer those comprehension questions.
So those compensators are still the students that have that same pattern as a dyslexic student in that they have weak word reading but very strong language comprehension. They just may still have fairly average word reading but a lot higher language comprehension. So they don't always get picked up for services, or we don't always maybe notice them as much, but they still have that same pattern of weaker word reading than they do language comprehension. We wouldn't necessarily call them dyslexic as we would with the kids that really struggle in that word reading.
Right. Well, and I think the other thing to think about, they still will need that decoding and phonemic awareness, but they're going to pick it up a lot more quickly, whereas dyslexics have to have so many more opportunities to practice and build the pathways because their working memory is typically often weak. And then if we move over on the right-hand side, we have they're weak in language comprehension, but strong in word reading, and that would be considered hyperlexic. And then the mixed reading difficulty is they're weak in all areas. So should be a small number of our kids.
When we think about these different types, so our hyperlexic are typically what we think about as, oftentimes I'll have teachers say they're word callers. So they can read anything you put in front of them on the page, but they don't understand anything they've read. They're very strong in that word reading, but they're weak in that language comprehension piece. So that is not a dyslexic student. That is a student that has a language comprehension difficulty. And so that's a different path we take for that student than we would for that student who's struggling with the word reading. The mixed reading difficulty then is really those students that just struggle across the board, typically are lower cognitive, lower language type students. Those students we wouldn't necessarily term dyslexic either because they're struggling in all areas. So I think this takes away some of that mystery around the term dyslexic. As Jenna read in that Kilpatrick quote, it really simply is those kids that struggle on the word reading side of that equation. And it is the most common type of the most common type of reading difficulty is that lower left box.
Okay.
We wanted to share with you some other resources that are out there that maybe some of you may not be aware of. I know when we've shared these before with some teachers in some of our classes, not everybody knew they were out there. So we wanted to make sure that everyone joining us today had access and knew that this information was out there. So on this slide that says Iowa Dyslexia Resources, they're starting back probably in 2014 when Iowa first had a definition of dyslexia. There was a group that put together an Iowa Dyslexia Resource site, and that site is still out there. It has resources to support both educators who serve students identified with dyslexia and parents of students with dyslexia. And again, when we say that, you will have students that maybe haven't been identified with that label but are still showing that pattern. Because again, in the school setting, and we'll look at that in some of our information sheets, we, in Iowa, because we're non-categorical, we wouldn't use the term dyslexia because we don't use labels.
I will say, so remember, students do not have to have an actual diagnosis to get the services that they need. If they're showing these signs of dyslexia or anything, if they are needing that instruction, they need to receive it.
So we would follow our same procedures through Child Find, through our 504 procedures. Those procedures would be followed despite whether the student had a label already or not. And you'll see that in some of these resources I'll share with you. So I'm just going to click on the Iowa Dyslexia Resources site, and you can see there's tabs up there gives a little bit of information about what is dyslexia, and we talked about that. There's some information specifically for educators. There's a tab for families, and then there's an additional resource tab. We're going to focus on that additional resources tab right now and share some information sheets that are out there for you that I think a lot of people have found helpful to be able to share with parents and teachers. So under that additional resources tab, if you scroll down, there's some links to some different, there's the Decoding Dyslexia Iowa that we talked about, the International Dyslexia Association has some information sheets there. The one we're going to focus on is Iowa's AEA Dyslexia Information Sheets. So I'm going to click on that one and show you some specific information that's out there. So this will just bring up a folder with some information sheets on different topics around dyslexia. So one of them is called About Dyslexia. That has some nice bullet points of things to keep in mind when you're talking to parents or teachers about dyslexia. So we want to recognize that dyslexia exists and is an educational diagnosis. I think for years, and I know I was probably guilty of this too, we said it was a medical diagnosis. But when you think back to what we just talked about in terms of education, the hallmarks of dyslexia, phonological awareness issues, decoding issues, those are educational issues. If you go down the next bullet point, we need to recognize that physicians will probably refer families to educators because we are the experts in those areas of phonological awareness, phonics. We are the experts in the area of reading, whereas a physician may not have that much knowledge around that. So I think sometimes it's frustrating for parents if a school is saying, well, it's a medical thing, but the medical world is saying it's an educational thing. So we want to be careful about calling it a medical diagnosis. Just because we can't use the term and just because we can't diagnose it in the school setting because we are non-categorical Doesn't mean we can't assess all of those areas in schools, doesn't mean we're not knowledgeable about all those areas as educators. So all those phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, all of those skills that we would want to see if a student has, we can look at that and we can match that instruction that to figure out what that student needs and match the instruction that they need, no matter what we call it. We focus on what are the student's strengths and needs and what instruction is a good match for that. Just some other things to point out on this particular sheet. Just some things to keep in mind. Parents may have outside information they would like to share. You know, we certainly would want to take a look at that.
Well, and I also think you really need to keep in mind the accommodations that the child will need. It's hard for children that are dyslexic to copy things from the board. It's very cumbersome for them to have to listen to a lecture and process and try to write. So they need notes provided for them where they can highlight or fill things in. Depending on what the writing assignment is, if we're just trying to get their ideas, then let them verbally tell it to a teacher and they can write, or they can, with all the technology we have, voice to text and all those things, make sure they have access so that they can access the material and things they need for that and for testing as well.
As you will see in the fourth bullet point there on this sheet, another thing to keep in mind is like many things, dyslexia varies from mild to severe. So you will have kids that only need accommodations and that are doing pretty well. Maybe don't qualify for special education services, maybe don't even need to be evaluated for special education services because their issues are fairly mild and can be addressed with the resources that we have through general education plus
A 504.
plus some accommodations, which might be done through a 504. So and then you might have kids that are very severe that need our most intense level of intervention. So it definitely varies. Those kids that have those difficulties, or even adults that have those difficulties in the phonological awareness and the word recognition side of the equation, within that, it can vary greatly from mild to severe. And then the last couple bullet points, just as we've talked about, just like we would with any student we're concerned about, we would follow our procedures that are in place. So if an educational disability is suspected, we would follow that process. If we would apply those standards of child find, as we would any time we have a student of concern, we would follow those procedures. I am going to go back to and click on another document that is helpful. There is a document called Dyslexia and AEA System Response. And this one is a two-pager, but the first page just talks about what dyslexia is, talks about the legislation around dyslexia that we have in our state. The first page talks about a lot about the universal screening we have in place in our early literacy initiatives that are in place. And so it talks about that we have a screener in place for all students now, and that's one way our state is addressing dyslexia, is that we now have a screener in place for K-3. There is some information on here that is a little bit dated now, so I would anticipate some of this is going to get updated as that task force does their work, and that this still refers to the third grade retention. If you go onto the second page, then at the beginning there, it talks about that learners who struggle to learn to read, including those with dyslexia, are required to receive appropriate service regardless of their educational label. So our system is designed to intervene early for all learners, and that's talked about in that K-3 reading screen. If you continue down that page, it talks about, in that third paragraph, although we do not label children with a diagnosis of dyslexia, we do serve learners with dyslexia in our special education programs. As a non-categorical state, we fulfill child find duties and serve learners with specific learning disabilities, including dyslexia. But because we are non-categorical, and this is something that's sometimes hard to explain to parents, because we are non-categorical, when we do an evaluation, we are not going to be able to say yes or no, your child has dyslexia, because we don't use labels in the educational setting. We are a non-categorical state, but we do fulfill the child find duties and serve learners with specific learning disabilities, including those with dyslexia. And again, you don't have to have that label. We're simply using the approach of looking at what the student's needs are and matching those to the appropriate instruction. And then it goes on to talk about, just as with our procedures that are in place, a parental request for an evaluation is always considered and provided a written response. And that all available information would be considered, whether that be information that's existing in the school or information parents have collected from outside the school.
Back to, we just wanted to share then some upcoming trainings and things that we have available for you, for your staff members regarding dyslexia. So Decoding Dyslexia, they have a conference every year. This year it's in October. We have the date there. It's in Ankeny. It's a very, very well done conference. It's 2 days. They bring in speakers and breakout sessions, and we've had the opportunity to go several years, and it's very worthwhile. So we would recommend if you want to send some staff there. There's also the California Dyslexia Guidelines linked there, and what I would want you to point or pull out of that, there are several pages that have warning signs broken down by grade level, starting already at preschool and all the way up to high school. And so it's very nice to kind of have some things in the back of your mind and for teachers to kind of look out for, so that we're not waiting and thinking a child's going to grow out of it. They will not grow out of dyslexia, but the earlier we can intervene, the stronger the possibility is that it will get a little bit easier for them. And then instructional practices that are not validated. This is sometimes a hot topic, but Deborah Reed from the Iowa Reading Research Center, she wrote a nice blog, I think last year, about dyslexia and some of the myths around it. And then there's also one here about some myth-busting common dyslexia cure claims, and it talks about some things such as visual therapy and color overlays and things like that. Those things may help a student that has some vision issues, but that's not helping dyslexia, and it's not going to fix their instructional needs and the phonological processing that they need. They still must have intense instruction in those areas. And then the last one here, can't quite scroll all the way down, some upcoming learning opportunities we have within the agency. We have our Essentials of Dyslexia class. It's a 2-day class, and you can get renewal credit. Once it will be offered in the Osceola Regional Office, April 3rd and 4th, and then another time in Missouri Valley at the regional office, June 10th and 11th. And it's kind of a guided book study using the book Dyslexia Assessment and Intervention. So that is linked, or there's a picture there too, and it's one that you would purchase outside and bring to the class.
This is a course we've taught several times before, so if you've had people go through this course, it's the same one. We do add a few things as we learn more, but it's still all centered around the same book. And like you said, it's kind of, we do a lot like a guided book study, but we're going to offer that again this spring and summer. Okay, we have come to the end of our time. Almost precisely, which is surprising. I'm usually over. So I don't know if we probably don't have time for necessarily questions, but one of the things that we thought, if we don't have editing rights to the agenda, but if we wanted to drop like a document or something in there, if people had questions, they could drop some questions in there and we could maybe put together a Q&A document or something, because I know this is really just scratching the surface. But our contact information is also on the first slide, so you're welcome to email us too if you have concerns that come up in your schools.
Thank you, Karen and Jenna, very much. We do have a tight agenda, but are there any burning questions out there? Anything that anyone would want to throw out here as we kind of come to the end of this portion? Any thoughts or questions? And I think, Karen and Jenna, what we, maybe what we'll do is, I think as this is being recorded, and of course we'll have a meeting this afternoon, I think maybe a follow-up email that we send out to people with that recording, maybe we'll include a form, and then that way people could add some questions that they might have, and we can maybe work on a Q&A, that type of thing. we have another topic where I think this next topic, I think we may have the same thing happening. There may be some follow-up questions, so we'll do that.
Okay, thank you.
If, would you be able to unshare that? Barbara?
Yes. Sorry, I had too many things open and I finally found it. So I think we're good.
Ron, this is Angie. I've created a question document where people can go in and type their questions, and then Karen and Jenna can answer them for us.
Perfect.
Linked in the agenda.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Oh, there's everybody seeing that on screen now? It's just a link right there for the notes. That's perfect. Wonderful. All right. We're going to jump right into our next agenda item. I'm going to kind of be leading us through this discussion. David Van Horn had sent out some homework to this group, I think, along with the invitation. We won't be checking to see if you did your homework. If you did, that's wonderful. But what he had shared is there was a live webinar by the Iowa DE on January 28th, and it was on the topic of the changes in graduation requirements for students with IEPs, and this issue of students who are targeting for a regular high school diploma must meet this 433 requirement, and it's kind of a significant change, and we wanted to talk about that a little bit. And I'm sensing already there's probably going to be some follow-up questions needed, but I'm going to put on screen here. This is, excuse me, a little bit here. This is linked in your agenda, along with some other resources from the DE. This is the PowerPoint from that presentation, and the video, of course, is a walk through all of this information. Kirsten Lane was part of that presentation. She's a newer this year secondary transition consultant with the Department of Education, and Ann Benshaw is a consultant that was also part of the presentation, an outside consultant going through this. And so I would like to, I'm not going to read the PowerPoint to you, but I want to use the PowerPoint to kind of hit on a couple of the key points or things that we learned from this new guidance. I'd love if this was, and again, I'm going to be watching our time here, but I'd love if this was a conversation. So as I'm hitting maybe on some of these key points, if anybody would like to stop me, chime in maybe with a question or a comment as we go, please feel free to do that. We'll try to work it that way. So let's dive in a little bit, and forgive me for doing some scanning here, but I think this might be the way we'll have to do it to kind of hit some key points here. Okay, the change, the big change here is just a kind of a reiteration of a legal requirement that had been in place in Iowa for some time, this 4333. So while for many years, districts in Iowa have had the decision-making authority of what their graduation requirements were for their students. There was this 4333. So while you have a lot of decision-making power, the law says and has said that to get a regular diploma in Iowa, you need 4 years of English, 3 years of math, 3 years of science, 3 years of social science. And this is not really the topic right now. They threw in the physical education requirements. But 4333. So we also in Iowa have historically, for students that have significant, most often very severe types of disabilities, we've routinely had this concept of graduation by IEP. So in other words, for students that have very severe, perhaps profound levels of intellectual disabilities or different kinds of disabilities, we have sometimes had IEP teams that have said, we're waiving, in a sense, some of these graduation requirements, and here's what the student needs to obtain. So this change is bringing it back, saying no matter what, regardless of your disability and the severity, you need to have 4.333 to get a regular high school diploma. And who does this impact? You know, we were hearing information on this really for over a year, and things were kind of finalized, you know, with the code clarification just last spring. And we had a lot of people worried, saying, how does this impact, you know, my kids with IEPs that are graduating this year and next year? The DE has, you know, officially clarified, and we had basically been told this last year. This will begin, or will be honored, I guess I should say, you know, with this year's 9th graders. Okay, so our current 2018 9th grade cohort would be the group where our guidance is that they should not get a regular high school diploma based on IEP goal attainment alone. And so, in other words, the 4.333 would apply starting with this year's 9th graders. Now, why they didn't use this word per se, I mean, that essentially means to me that our other kids that are, you know, already in high school and progressing, you know, there could be this concept of grandfathering them. But you know, we have been asked or guided by the DE that to apply this rule to our current 9th grade group. So bear with me as I scan a little bit here. Lots and lots of information, but I wanted to cut to a couple really key points, and then we can talk more about it. District policy considerations. And I was going to mention too, I do a lot of communicating with our strategists to ID teachers, those teachers that are working with kids with the most severe disabilities. And I want to share some of this, you know, fairly new guidance with that group. But we know that as they start thinking about how this applies to their kids, they're going to be looking to some of you folks that are policymakers per se. And so that's really why it's a good good topic for us to tackle today. So first off, districts, again, retaining your decision-making authority. You know, while the rule says any kid who is trying to get a regular diploma should do 4.333, Iowa code doesn't specify certain courses. Districts do this. So you're in the decision-making place for that. But districts need to articulate what a diploma is awarded on, and the specific standards and requirements for each course that must be successful to meet progress towards 4.333. And in doing that, what was talked about at this webinar was a kind of a decision point. Is your district going to allow multiple pathways to achieve 4.333? Now, you know, it's been clarified that we should not, moving forward, say, Susie will graduate based on what her IEP team says, meeting the goals there and those kinds of things. We now know that you know, those things are worked on, but they must achieve 4.333. But the first decision point is, will your district allow multiple pathways to achieve 4.333? And you can decide no. Okay, so you could decide in awarding regular high school diplomas, all students must meet the criteria we have in place to achieve 4 years of English, 3 years of math, etc. If you do that, you'll need to be thinking about some of these questions that you see on the screen here right now. How will students, parents, and district staff be informed? You know, I think we all know that, you know, this topic could be a highly emotional topic. That would vary by family, but you know, just this idea of we wouldn't want a family that has a student with a severe disability to find out, you know, in the last hour before, you know, finishing school, that they're not going to get a diploma. They might get a certificate. But that is an option, you know, offering certificate options, certificate of attendance. What might you offer? So So that was the first decision point. A district can say, no, we're not going to look at this alternate pathway. And you could, this one thing that was talked about in the context of the whole presentation was that this does not impact FAPE for kids. This does not impact free appropriate public education. They must receive that through age 21 if necessary. So this is not taking special education services away from students at all. That all has to be provided, and all students should have an opportunity to earn 4.333. But for a regular high school diploma, it may be that you might opt to not use this multiple pathways approach. What if you decide the opposite? What if your answer is yes? We think we will allow multiple pathways. So we know we can't just say, you've met your IEP, you may graduate. We know we have to document 4.333. So think about what options you could offer. How will students, parents, and district staff be informed of that? So thinking all these questions ahead of time. And moving ahead, there's this is a kind of a brief listing of what these pathways or modifications per se might look like. So for example, allowing changes to the courses required by the local district for one or more of the 4.333 core areas. Because remember, Iowa's not requiring certain courses. They're just requiring a year, and year is the key there. The code doesn't define Carnegie units. It's 4 years of English, 3 years of math, and so on. So different courses. And I believe in the recording you would see they were, I think some of the examples they gave had more to do with, like, even more of your traditional math courses, like, would there be changes of, if you have algebra as a requirement, maybe that would change for a multiple pathway kind of a student. Changes to course requirements, allow alterations to the requirements, such as proficiency levels, genre, demonstration of knowledge. So that is talking about some modifications to the courses. Changes to course standards. They give the example here of, could you allow the identification of foundational standards or key standards that might be more relevant to a student's post-secondary expectations if they were participating in one of the 4.333 classes. Changing the number of standards in a course experience, maybe a reduction of standards, that type of thing. And then they mention changes for students identified for alternate assessment. And in my mind, this is the primary population of kids that I think we're all talking about. In the DE's presentation, but they didn't indicate that was the case. There are other students that have different kinds of disabilities that have sometimes been waived from the 4.333. But if we think about our group of students that is identified for alternate assessment, we know there are kids that have a documented intellectual disability. They have delays in adaptive behavior, and the IEP team has determined that they need that they are working on modified standards, which are what we call the Iowa Core Essential Elements. Okay? So they mention here, could students access the standards through the essential elements or align standards that help the student focus on meaningful, personally relevant functional skills? Earlier in the presentation, more was said about the essential elements as I kind of glossed through to get to some of the key points here. And we know that they're not considered replacements for Iowa Core standards. They're maybe a better word is a pathway or a bridge. Okay, so if you're familiar with the essential elements, they often look like Iowa Core standards that sometimes are reduced in cognitive complexity. So we think of those as a bridge to allow kids with more severe disabilities to access the standards. So they are, in this presentation, using the essential elements was shared as a possible pathway. Then a few more here. Change the location of instruction. And, here's a unique one. For example, allow students to demonstrate aligned standards through work experience within a school building or at job sites. Could that be a social science class? Could that be science? So even something that you might think of as being pretty innovative was shared as a possible pathway to achieve 433. And then they go on to say other unique individualized ways. I'm talking an awful lot. How about if I pause and any burning questions that come to mind right now from what we've talked about so far? Let me just pause for a minute and listen to what you're thinking.
Ron, this is Cindy Menendez. So basically what you're saying is to award a diploma based on a different path to 4333, and it's up to it's the decision of the district what that looks like, as long as 4333 is met in a way acceptable at the district level.
That yeah, I feel like that's a good way of summarizing it, Cindy. I think you did that well. They did reinforce this, district's retained decision-making authority. So I think what you said is true. I think what my feeling, and I see if other people feel this way too, I think a lot of districts will be challenged though, saying, okay, how do I know that this is right? What's on the screen right now, demonstrating standards through work experience. What does that look like? That's going to be the tricky part. But yes, what you said, Cindy, if a student, let's just say that maybe has a very severe disability, is on a path for a regular high school diploma, we will want to be able to clearly document that they've done 4 years of English, 4 years of math, but multiple pathways are allowed.
Ron, this started as a result of like an ESSA audit or something. Is that right? Or why did this start? What started all this conversation?
I believe you're right, Jason. I believe that as ESSA was rolling out, just the topic of how students with disabilities graduate came into play, and then through discussions at the state level, it was kind of pointed out that that we technically are violating our own state law, saying that all kids must have 4333. And that was put out there when these rule changes were out there. It was put out there for public comment. There was some of that. There was some discussion of, is this violating student rights, things like that. And the determination was no. It would be violating students' rights, absolutely. If something happened that would not allow students to have FAPE. But this is talking about a regular high school diploma versus FAPE. What's on the screen here too, some of you know that I kind of dabble in the alternative assessment world with and work with some of our teachers in this area. There is going to be I know the Department of Ed is going to put together questions have already been submitted, from some of the AA contacts even a ways back, and also post webinar. And I know they're going to release some kind of a Q&A. A question, a question that I had personally, is regarding alternate assessment students. And my question was, if a teacher is doing quality SDI, aligned with the essential elements, which we view as pathways to the core standards. For example, in English language arts, and math. Could that instruction serve two purposes? Could that be their, a year of English, a year of math, along with, their SDI? I have my thought is that someone will probably say no, but I wonder about that. Because then we get into this idea of, SDI is normally supplementing. It's special instruction, on top of core instruction. But that is a question that at some point, I would like to get some really clear guidance, through DE and at that level.
What would help me, Ron, and it's probably embedded in this type of document, but I'd like to see a profile case study approach of here's 2 paragraphs about a student that would receive this type of diploma, and here's 2 paragraphs of a student that would receive an alternative diploma. Because I feel like when this first came out, it was really, really tight. And now, you had 3 exceptions on the screen there a moment ago that I feel like loopholes is not a positive word, but I feel like, we've very rarely, if you don't want to have an alternative diploma, you've got 3 avenues there, 3 options as a district to make sure that doesn't happen. So I don't know. I don't want to play games with this, but those 3 examples are pretty loose that you had on the screen before. So I don't know. I'd like to see what would help me more is what's a profile of a student that would not get a regular diploma when you take those exceptions that you had on there, when you keep those in mind.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Jason. I mean, and I think that's a good word for it. If we could see like a case studies or, scenarios of it. Here's Johnny. Here's what it maybe looked like.
Yeah, scenarios. Scenarios is a good word.
Yeah, so that we can hope that maybe something like that will come, but I mean, this is kind of this is what we have right now. But I totally agree with you. Those pathways that I had up on the screen there open up a pretty broad net, and that's kind of why I'm a little bit stuck on. We have some teachers who are doing some excellent SDI, for using the essential elements for literacy and math, and kids are getting quality instruction that's aligned with the essential elements, which is then aligned with the Iowa core standards. So that was my question. If we can be loose enough to say that you might earn might earn a year of a class through work experience, could we not use that special ed time as well?
Well, an area we can all get better on is transition. And if students can get credit through a work-based learning experience, as part of a transition plan, and then that can count for some of these standards, hey, I'm all in on that. That's great.
But I mean, I think one scenario I could probably say right now is that, what if Susie, a current freshman, gets to, a couple of years down the road here, is about to graduate, and Susie has never taken anything the district would deem social studies or science, period. I think that would be a student where they would say, you may not have a regular diploma because you have not done that 3-3. Now, but if Susie has done, those courses in a multiple pathway, that would be different. But so I think probably the clearest example of someone who would not get a regular diploma in the future would be if the district documentation was that they didn't at all even attempt, a year of English, 4 years of English, 3 years of math, 3 years of science, and so forth.
Yeah, that's a great example. And as you talked, my stomach turned a little bit because that becomes more of a responsibility of districts and teachers, and as opposed to parents and families. We've got to communicate that message right there so it's really, really clear. And then we have to provide those options for those kids so that way when she's a senior, it doesn't come back on us, hey, we never talked about it, or those options weren't available. So I like your example. That helped me.
you know, I just wonder, you know, just, you know, what, you know, could a district say that, you know, maybe a student with a more involved disability is maybe taking family consumer science, might be an excellent class for them, you know, could that be a science, whereas it would normally not be a science class, you know, for the general education population. So just different pathways, but you know, but I know districts are going to be thinking, you know, they're going to want to know, here's what we think, is that okay? And on one hand, I think the DE is saying, hey, you've got the decision-making authority, but I'm thinking, hoping, you know, we will get some ongoing guidance here, and I think the scenario example that you gave there would be, I'd be hopeful for that. That would be really helpful.
Hey, Ron.
Yeah.
I had to step out for just a minute, but there were a couple of questions that people asked, and I don't know if they were responded to. So one would be, so would the essential standards be standalone classes or written into an IEP? That would be one question.
Would the essential standards?
So would these essential standards be standalone classes or written into an IEP?
When
Mark, if you wanted to clarify, Mark Weiss asked that question.
I'm wondering, when you say essential standards, do we mean essential elements or something else?
Well, I'm guessing what he means is for kiddos on alternate assessment, do you have to have standalone classes labeled English, math, science, or can it be written into this IEP some way where it's kind of embedded within what they're already doing?
Okay, no, it's a great question, and that was what, and that might have been right when you stepped out, Angie. That actually was my that was my question that I was even chatting during the live webinar that I hope is going to be talked about in the Q&A, because I think it's the same question I had, was that if a teacher is doing quality SDI for literacy and math aligned with numbers, and that is their SDI, could that, I'll just use the word, could that double as a year of English, as a year of math? I think that's the same question that was. Okay. So, and I do not have an answer for that, but I'm hopeful we'll get one.
Okay. Well, the other question was, for students on alternate assessment, do they need to be proficient on the essential elements or just have access to them to earn 4.333?
Actually, I don't know that this is really, might sound silly to say, but I don't even know that this is talking about proficiency. It's talking about, did they take, did they have 4 years of English, 3 years of math? So I don't know that, it sounds kind of silly to say. I mean, for our general ed population, you know, we think of, well, yeah, they failed the class, so I guess they didn't get it, you know, that year of English. But I think in the multiple pathways discussion, they even talk about modifying the level of proficiency. So in my mind, there could be modifications, you know, in the proficiency expectations for a student that might be in an English class or something like that. So there's, yeah, so I don't see that that's an issue here.
Thank you. I also created a Google question and answer doc for this topic, and it is linked into your agenda. And I did go ahead, someone put that question that I just asked you in there. So we'll thoughtfully respond to that and other questions.
Excellent.
There's one more question. Does this impact licensure or certification? Does the math unit have to come from a math teacher, or may a SPED teacher provide the math unit, such as pull-out math scenario provided by SPED teacher above and beyond the SDI?
Great question. That was also one of mine. and I believe it's already in the funnel for what that will come out of the DE as a Q&A. And that question in some format did come up in the live webinar. And the answer was generally, a teacher has to be appropriately licensed for the content that they're teaching. But what the part of the answer that we didn't get was that we've had this conception of highly qualified special education teacher in Iowa for a number of years. Now we know that with the ESSA, the term highly qualified has kind of gone away, and there's just more general discussion about, you know, teachers need to be appropriately licensed for what they're teaching. But in the past, you know, I think we know that, for example, Strategist 2 teachers, Strategist 2 ID teachers, through a reverse consultation model, could in fact teach math, teach English, by virtue of you know, collaborating with a content teacher. I did not get a clear answer on that issue now as it applies to these new guidelines. And see, that to me, that kind of ties in to the other question that you read, Angie. You know, so if we have our Strategist 2 ID teachers who have kids in SDI and they're doing good quality literacy and math instruction, you know, they're doing that as their SDI, but are we permitted to count that time as a year of English, a year of math? And then the question that you brought up, licensure, do they need to have an English endorsement? So if that's not in our current document here for Q&A, I know it's already been submitted, and I think the DE Q&A is going to probably give us, I'm hopeful, of a clear answer on that one.
Thanks, Ron.
And then I'll just, time is getting away from us here, but this one screen here is just, you know, prepare for collaboration. You know, so some of you folks at the policy level, you know, we start this thinking process of, you know, how we're going to look at this, you know, that key question, are we going to allow multiple pathways or not? What would that look like? And then IEP teams, you know, you can see what it's saying here, beginning in 8th grade, you know, looking at the future here, students about to go into high school, what will that pathway look like? And then parents, families need to understand these changes, because obviously we don't want to cause confusion or upset by a family being surprised at, you know, this issue of regular diploma or not. Okay. All right. We'll end there, and here's on the screen. Thanks, Angie, for adding that link there. Please do add questions, and we'll, yeah, I mean, I will, if some of those questions are not answered through the coming DEQA, we'll resubmit them and try to get some more clarity on those. All right, I want to move us along. Jenny, are you, Jenny Barnett, are you with us?
I have Jenny's information if she's not back yet. She had an appointment this morning. So I can share.
If you would, Angie, that would be great.
All right, so Jenny wanted to be brief, so I will try to be brief as well. The 4 talking points that she wanted me to share were, 1, that $3 million is being allocated, we hope, so keep your fingers crossed, by the governor for school-based mental health for next year. The details are still in the works, but we're advocating and lobbying for it to go to the AEAs equally and not out for bid or anything like that. So when we say equally, I don't know if that means each AEA would get X number of dollars or if it would be based on the current allocations that we get. Each AEA gets a percentage of money generally based on their student population. So I'm not sure how that would look, but it would be great if the state would allocate money to support mental health services in the school. The second piece would be Green Hills AEA, specifically Jenny is spearheading that charge. She's working with a group of superintendents to create 2 classrooms for students with mental health and behavioral needs. We are currently in the planning process, more details to come, but the hope is to have 2 programs up and running in Green Hills by fall. I do believe that she has interest from at least 15 superintendents, and I think 8 of those superintendents would be interested in hosting a site. We kind of envision expanding that beyond 2, but the goal is for 2 to be created by the fall that would be run by the AEA, and districts would pay for a spot in that program. So more details to come on that. The third item is that Green Hills is working on creating a continuum of mental health supports so we can provide for our districts. One possible solution is a community resource navigator, and this person would be like a service coordinator that we have in early access, but for the districts. And this person would connect and create partnerships with current agencies and in the communities to help children with mental health needs. There's no guarantees with this, but this is something we're looking into. And then the final talking point she wanted me to share is that the chief administrators across the state of the AEA have 3 strategic goals that they're going to be focusing on the next year or so. One of those is the mental health needs of students. The second one is college and career readiness. And the third is aligning the AEA system statewide. So we're all kind of working in conjunction with each other rather than going out and doing things on our own. So with their push towards mental health, the governor's push towards funding with mental health, and some of the work we're doing internally, we hope that in the fall we can begin supporting with you these children that we have in our schools that really need, mental health support and services. So any questions about that? I don't know if I'll be able to answer them, but I can certainly write them down and talk to Jenny and get those responses to you. It's kind of exciting time and long overdue.
Very good. Thanks, Angie.
Sure.
Just real quick, transportation, if something like that was to happen, I don't know, would that be on the individual district to transport students?
Yes, generally the resident district or attending district is responsible for those transportation costs to get to the program. So that would not change.
Yep.
Yep.
That Jenny has at least 8 superintendents she shared recently that are involved in a team that's working out some of those details. And so I'm sure that question, if it hasn't came up, will come up, and that'll be worked through with the superintendents.
Okay, excellent. I am going to, and I'm sure, Lynn, you're with us, aren't you? There's Lynn. Lynn Hockenberry is going to spend some time updating us on some of our activities and supporting special design instruction, particularly through the professional development grant that's happening in a number of our districts. And Lynn, shall I unshare, and would you want to share your screen? Is that going to work best?
Yes, I would like to do that, Ron. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be with you today, and I'm happy and excited to talk with you and begin sharing this work. We have been involved in Green Hills AEA for 7 years with SDI literacy, and this work that I'm going to talk to you about today really extends and expands upon that. Before I even go there, I want to say how grateful we are for the partnerships we've had with our local education agencies over the last 7 years, and what kinds of exciting changes we have seen in terms of instruction for students with reading disabilities. And we are thrilled and continue to learn and grow together with our teachers to make a difference for our students. And so as a part of this, the framework that we're going to see and the state personnel development grant work that I want to talk to you about today really extends and expands on the work that we've been doing. And so that's exciting as we think about moving forward in the future. So first of all, I'm going to just share with you, I'm sure this definition is very familiar to all of you, but it is the SDI definition. It is the IDEA definition of specially designed instruction. So when we think about it, I think about how important it is to look at the needs of the learner, the content, the methodology, and or the delivery of instruction in order to address their unique needs. So that's really the frame around which we operate, and that's the frame for which the SDI framework was developed as a part of the State Personnel Development Grant. So in Iowa, our SDI framework that we'll be sharing was the result of first of all, our directors meeting together in 2013, the state special ed directors, the AEA directors, and a number of LEA directors meeting and identifying what were some key components that they felt would help get everyone on the same page as we looked at and operationalized specially designed instruction in the state of Iowa. So it started with a number of key components, and they refined it down to 4, and then they developed a framework. The first framework was developed in 2014-15. That happened to be the same time that the State Personnel Development Grant was written and received in the state of Iowa. And as I alluded to, we'll be talking some more about that as time goes on. And you can also see the timeline where school sites and usability sites were developed. And then eventually in 2016-17, we had over 50 sites, and that work continues today. So the framework was developed as we began working on the grant. So the State Personnel Development Grant was received, and it started on October 1st of 2015. We are obviously in year 4 of the grant. Eric Gephardt, who is the state director of our State Personnel Development Grant, wants us to think about that, yes, we had this grant, and yes, we're almost done with the grant's funding. But the purpose of the grant was really to get us going with a state system in order to prepare and personnel and to effectively implement SDI instruction. So that's an important thing, important frame for us to consider as we move forward. While the grant is ending, it's created the infrastructure for us to continue the great work we're doing. So Iowa's purpose within the grant was to improve practitioner abilities to do really 3 things: diagnose, design, and deliver high quality specially designed instruction so that all learners, those with and without disabilities, are successful. And as we worked towards that, the grant helped us to establish a technical assistance system. And that system was focused on improving literacy instruction first, because it's very tightly aligned with ELI and very tightly aligned with our state goals within C4K, and that is to improve literacy achievement. As you take a look at the framework in a couple of minutes, we'll see that it really could be applied generically across content areas. The focus right now has been on literacy. So a technical assistance system, also a coaching network. That coaching network is around SDI literacy, and it's just beginning to roll out, and we're looking at and working with our PLC coaches to think about how those things can be integrated. The third thing is high quality professional development so that we can improve specially designed literacy instruction, and that literacy instruction is implemented with fidelity and effectively improves reading proficiency for a wide range of learners. So thinking about that, this is the framework, the SDI framework: design, diagnose, design, deliver, and engage. And in your slide deck at the top of this note, which I'm not seeing at the moment, let me hide that. You can see right here the SDI framework. There is a link to a document that is 4 pages that talks not only about the framework, but about some guiding principles that help us to think about what must be in place to ensure that diagnose, design, deliver, and those indicators for family support are fully implemented within our state. Much of this will look familiar to you because it builds upon the work that we're doing. And then as we tease out all of these layers, it helps us to think about what are all the components that need to be in place to get at these 9 key components, as well as the indicators supporting engagement. So as I think about this and we continue to talk, we're looking at right now in Iowa through the State Personnel Development Grant, there have been 3 key strands, and the 4th is just starting. Those strands are preschool, K-6, significant disabilities, and then the family and school partnerships. Woven throughout all of those is assistive technology. And at one point, assistive technology was its own strand. As the work began and started to really develop, we realized that really assistive technology is not a standalone. It is woven throughout each of those strands and the work that we're doing in schools. So what does this mean for you? Where are we at in Green Hills AEA? We wanted you to know who the strands are and who those usability sites are. Within our grant, we call them usability sites, not pilots, because we try things with the usability sites and then we refine them, bring them back to the usability sites and say, what do we need to do to continue to improve these, this package of professional development, the way that we're coaching, the things that we're doing. So K-6 was the first strand to get involved. We currently have 5 schools involved in K-6. The 2 schools that have been at this work the longest are Atlantic, Schuler, and Washington Elementaries, Clark Elementary in Osceola. We started with that group 4 years ago in the 15-16 school year. And then we added Clarinda and Logan Magnolia, and last year Missouri Valley was added. For preschool started their work during the 16-17 school year. We have 3 usability sites. Fortunately, there's some overlap. So Atlantic has a preschool site and a K-6 site. Clark has a preschool site and a K-6 site. And then Glenwood has a preschool site as well. For the significant disability site, we actually have 2 schools involved now. Carter Lake and Hoover are both involved as one site for significant disabilities within our schools. Now I'd like to focus just a little bit about what it's looked like within one of our schools. And I want to do this especially because Atlantic has been involved not only with the work in SPDIG, but they've also been really focusing on universal tier and working through the UTT guide to make improvements for all students and to think about what that means for all of our students as well. So I just had an opportunity to look at some of the data and work with their data team a week or 2 ago. I guess it was last week. With all these snow days, it's hard to remember where we're at, isn't it? So we took a look at all students with IEPs, first of all, on the winter FAST benchmarks. And for all students with IEPs, 25% of those students hit benchmark. That may not sound high, but when we think about students with IEPs, we know that they have significant reading disabilities that are impacting their scores and are impacting their ability to perform. So we celebrate that 25%. One of the other things that we celebrated is that we look at accuracy, because as you remember from listening to Jenna and Karen earlier, they talked about how important it is to have accuracy first before we continue with looking at how we improve rate. And what we know is 59% of those students had met accuracy benchmark in the fall, and in the winter, 76% did. And also another really big component for us is growth, and growth to close the gap. So for all students with IEPs, K-5, 64% of those students made made sufficient progress to close that gap, to narrow that gap in performance. So as we think about that, we're celebrating that. And the reasons we have all those things in place is because their school really believes in that all students are general ed students first. Students with disabilities are general ed students first. How are we supporting them within the general ed classroom? How are we making sure that they receive the kinds of interventions they need beyond that time they spent with special education? And really, that is because we know that whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. And this really speaks to what I was just talking about. SDI, our guiding principle, is that it is delivered by special education and general education teachers and professionals in various settings across the school day. And you'll notice that SDI is throughout the triangles of MTSS in a multi-tiered system of support. We used to think about SDI being up here, but that doesn't really account for all of the needs that students with IEPs have, which include, it may be very, very important, in fact it is very important, that a general ed teacher, perhaps in science, know how to and can help a student with a reading disability access text through the use of Bookshare or through the use of any type of assistive technology. They have to be able to provide those cues and prompts for them to access the general ed curriculum. And that becomes a critical point as we think about how SDI is implemented throughout the day and throughout the curriculum, throughout all tiers. This really ties in with what you've been hearing about with differentiated accountability. And we are really working and focusing as a system on helping all learners be successful in those academic standards. And so differentiated accountability helps us think about where we're at and where we're at in terms of our healthy indicators and the conceptual areas that schools are working with through SAMI and that the AEA is working with through AMY. This is even a bigger, broader picture. And so I know you all are familiar with ESSA. ESSA is here on this side. And when we think about ESSA, what we know is that we have some schools, many schools, who are targeted in the area of reading IEPs. And I know that's been a question, or in the area of IEPs. And I know that's been a question about what are we going to do. When we think about the system, what's important for us to remember is that guiding principle is that students with IEPs are first and foremost general ed learners. And so we have to make sure that there's a solid system of support in place for them. And so we start with looking at the general ed system. We start with thinking about how we can improve the core for all students. And then as we continue and look at our data, we dig deeper and we'll have some things in place to help support schools as they think about students with IEPs on a system-wide approach, especially in the area of literacy. So over here we have targeted and comprehensive schools, and many things are required as a part of that. Going through SAMI is required, and entering data in CASA is required. Some things are online. There's some differentiation going on. Of course, for healthy indicators, it's not required, but all schools are welcome to attend those trainings. And we're thrilled that within Green Hills, we have so very many schools who have been going through the process that puts us further ahead as we think about next steps. So now you see some timelines. Excuse me for just a minute. This is a big, very busy graph. I'll let you take a look at it first as I take a drink. And you can really see where we're at in terms of ESSA. We are working here, and in terms of the SDI literacy timelines, we're working also within this. And then when we think about IDEA-DA, which is the differentiated accountability timelines, we are really looking at full implementation beginning after the 21-22 school year. Also, you'll notice in here, this is B13, which is, of course, the transition, and we're looking at that as being fully implemented and supports in place fully in the 21-22 school year as well. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and take time for some questions. That was a very fast overview. What I do want you to know is that Green Hills is a usability AEA, and so we are currently in the process of bringing all of our consultants up to speed about the State Personnel Development Grant around the SDI framework, because we anticipate that there will be work that will be ongoing in schools beginning probably next year. There will be more information about that in the spring. Later this spring, we'll have some guidance from the department about what schools may be ready and in place to move forward with this bigger idea of an SDI framework in the area of literacy and how we can help all of our schools be supported. I'll stop. If you have questions, on the slide deck is my email as well. That only took me 15 minutes, which was quite fast for me to get done with that. So I just put you a little bit ahead of schedule. What questions do we have? I'm not seeing any in the chat window. But if you do have questions or you want to know how to get more information, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer those questions and happy to continue to make connections to the work we're already doing.
All right, thanks, Lynn. Okay. We will keep on moving ahead here. Next on our agenda, there are, well, a couple topics here, and we just have them listed as informational items that we wanted to point out to you. And so let's tackle those now. And starting with Title I guidance. Now, there's a couple guidance pieces here that are linked to your agenda that we'll touch on. Kind of hot off the press. They're just guidance pieces from the Department of Education that landed on the Iowa DE site. I know David Van Horn wanted us to look at a few of these or at least talk through them. They had come up in discussion with the state directors group. But first one is Title I. So let me just open that, and you've got this link to your agenda. You can see it's a fairly recent guidance piece, January 2019. And I was actually really happy to see this out there because I think this is, interestingly, kind of almost a myth buster kind of a thing, an area where I think we've had confusion, in my opinion, for years in Iowa. So this issue of students with disabilities that may have an IEP, can they participate in Title I? And what's the answer? Anybody want to throw it out there?
Yes.
The answer is yes. And for many years, the answer that was given to people was sometimes no, or sometimes it depends. But this document kind of fleshes it out here. You can see here, point number 1, children with disabilities may participate in Title I services. Okay, so that's a pretty clear point there. So it talks about it actually being contrary to law, excluding kids with disabilities from receiving those Title I services. Let's just go through these. Number 2, children with disabilities may receive Title I services in their special education goal areas. Okay, so it talks about this commonly held belief, or really misconception over the years, that, for example, a student with a special education goal in reading cannot receive title reading services. And again, they talk about that being contrary to federal guidance. And so that is allowable. But points 3 and 4 kind of give us a little bit of a caveat. So 3 says Title I funds may not be used to provide services required under special education law. And so services required for a student to receive FAPE are not supposed to be supported by Title I funds. And so they give an example. If a child's IEP calls for 45 minutes a week, SDI and reading, Title I funds are not supposed to be used to pay for that in particular. Okay, so that, think about, almost your traditional 45 minutes of SDI being provided by a special education teacher. That time that appears on the IEP is not supposed to be funded through Title I. But point 4 kind of clears things up. Title I funds may be used to coordinate with or supplement special education services. So while the Title I funds are not supposed to be used to pay for what's written in the IEP, here's an example. A school's Title I criteria determines that a child would receive 120 minutes a week in reading instruction. Special education might be responsible for 45 minutes, and Title I would be responsible for at least 75 minutes. Okay, so that's an example. So coordinate with or supplement, but not taking over payment for what's explicitly in the IEP. Second example, a child who's eligible for Title I services in math. What if they need a paraeducator to address health needs? Title I provides additional instruction in math, and special education funds may pay for the paraeducator. So just a different kind of example of where Title I may not be funding what's explicitly in the IEP, but covering other needs that show up. So that was, I think this is a guidance piece that it really is a kind of a myth buster, and they were pretty concise with it. Any thoughts about that or questions and how that might impact your school services? Okay. ESYS guidance. This is a even hotter off the press document that was put together by the Department of Education just in February. So really brand new here, and this is this document might be a little bit more painful to read through. I'll point out a few things on it, but this is not. There's even notes on here that just point out that this document is considered advisory, not replacing the rules and procedures that we have in place, but this is advisory from the Iowa DE, kind of working with districts saying, here's some considerations you should take into account when doing ESYS. There's a lot of references to case law in here. And so, that tells us that what I think we already know, that, the issue of ESYS, there's been a lot of litigation out there. There's been disagreements across the country about when students should or should not require extended school year services. And so this is some additional guidance to, I think, to help IEP teams walk through this process. And again, I will not, they kind of go through 10 points and give lots of considerations, but hitting a couple high points. One issue, I think this is a nice piece right here. Just a reminder, I don't think this is a revelation to anybody, but ESYS should be very, very highly individualized. It's based on that individual student needs. And so we definitely want to refrain from, we wouldn't want to make statements to indicate that certain groups of kids would get it and other groups would not. So, you can see some of the examples. Contrary to law statements, only our level 3 students receive ESYS, or Only the life skills kids would be eligible for that. We don't want to view it that way. It should be highly individualized on the student level. Okay. This one, again, I don't want to read every single thing to you, but this is an important one, and this is one I know that comes up. I know it's come up in discussions that I've had with districts and families before. Because ESYS it's part of FAPE, it's not just an add-on or an extra. It's if needed, it's part of that free appropriate public education for kids. It is supposed to be provided by appropriately licensed personnel. Okay. So an example, and here's one that would affect the AA. If a child's ESYS calls for occupational therapy services from the AA, those services must be provided or appropriately supervised by an OT. Okay, so just pointing out that an appropriately licensed person would need to provide them. And so that, I know that comes up with instructional services as well. We can use our Strategist 2 teacher example. What if a student that's being, their services are coordinated during the school year by a Strategist 2 teacher? What if they need literacy ESYS in the summer? Should that be provided by an appropriately licensed teacher? The answer here is yes. The reality is, can that be very tricky to find the right personnel in the summer? It definitely can. I think one caveat, and I know this has happened in districts a number of times, and this is what I often will, encourage people to think through. Notice it says appropriately supervised. So for example, you could, perhaps for our OT example here, could the support services be provided by someone without that license if it was supervised or planned by someone that had it? So I would see that happening for school services as well. Possibly, the typical special education teacher with that licensure could plan and supervise instruction, but someone else may carry it out. So that was brought up there. This is one I wanted to highlight. There's nothing requiring that ESYS decisions be made at a certain time of the year in terms of rule. I know in our procedures, it talks about, kind of the springtime, several months before it would happen as a reasonable way of thinking, but, and that's kind of what's being reinforced here. IEP teams should make those decisions sufficiently in advance of the end of the school year so that, well, first of all, so that, you can make the appropriate arrangements and so that parents can use their procedural safeguards if they disagree. So, for example, if an IEP team said we will not be doing ESYS in May and a parent disagreed, obviously the timeline would be difficult there because summer is starting. So just an encouragement to make those decisions early enough so that we can avoid some of those kinds of things. Okay, so it's just, those were kind of some key points to remember. It goes on to talking about, kind of a fleshed out version of the different considerations determining if a student is eligible. And I guess I would just, I think it's a good document to use for your own guidance. If you have parents that are maybe requesting ESYS and your IEP team may not be agreeing with that, this might be a good document to grab onto to kind of guide you through the process. I know also that deep in this document, there's obviously a lot of detail and a lot of legal references. One thing, and I know David had even kind of put a bullet point here so we'd remember to mention this. It mentions in there just this is not ESYS is not an extra thing, an add-on. It's part of FAPE for the students that need it. And so when we make decisions about it, we want that to be in the prior written notice. We know that prior written notice document, that we use that when we're proposing something or when we're refusing it. So for example, if the parent said, I want summer services, and we said no, we'd want the prior written notice to document that and indicate the reasons why. We also want that prior written notice to indicate if we're proposing that kind of service. So that's kind of just a reminder to treat this as an integral part of the IEP. How about any thoughts or questions, or does anybody want to share any challenges they've had with this, looking at this issue of eligibility for ESYS? Any thoughts out there? Sounding pretty quiet. I'm practicing my wait time, but we'll move on. So that guidance is there. Tuck that away as maybe a good resource when you're going through some of these decisions, especially if they're the tricky ones. Excuse me. Last informational topic we wanted to touch on, the ISASP, the new state assessment that's coming soon. I know that I'm sure that each of your districts is actively working on making sure you're ready for that. I think probably most districts are going to be using the electronic version. Some will be using paper pencil version, but we know that's coming soon. And so for this group, we wanted to just kind of touch on the issue of accommodations for students with disabilities on the new state assessment. And I just, the link that I put here is just, this was kind of all in one place here, so I just linked this to our agenda. This is some information I had sent out back in December through our special education blog, and a lot, so the teachers would start thinking through this. There is a state site on the ISASP, and I know some of your technology coordinators have been using that to kind of guide the process to get ready for the testing itself. But as far as accommodations, I kind of have summarized here, and then the link to the whole manual. There is very specific guidance for this new test of how we would address student accommodations, and they have a 3-tier process in using these things. And I actually think I know it's going to be a challenge for everybody to implement a brand new test, especially one that's electronically delivered. But I think there's some really very exciting, good features on there that will, I think they'll be really helpful for our kids with disabilities. And so the first tier is universal features. And the interesting thing about this is that's available to all students. Okay, and so just a couple examples, and we'll peek at the actual manual here in a second before we wrap up. But just examples of those universal features, things like amplification. There's an answer eliminator. So on, perhaps in the past, on a paper pencil kind of a test, students would strike through answers they did not want. There's an electronic version of that. Calculator, equation editors, those kinds of things are just embedded in there. Electronic highlighting, and even they mention extended time, which really means that ISASP is not a time test, so it's just different there. So there are some, some items that are universal. They're available to all students, not just students that have disabilities. Then, so going one tier up, there are some designated features. They are also available to all students. However, they must be indicated in the system in advance. So, there's this idea of, in ISASP and the electronic profile, certain features can be turned on for students in advance. Okay? So even though these may be features that are appropriate for kids with IEPs or 504 plans, they're available to all students, but they must be designated. They must be turned on the system before they're used. And you can see I put in bold italics here. Those designated features should align with the classroom supports that they're getting currently in the classroom. So it's really, you can kind of see that, looking at the tiers here, it's really kind of, they've done this in a way that kind of aligns with an MTSS way of thinking. So there may be students that are getting a certain level of intervention out there, and some of these designated features may be appropriate for them. We should use them if that's what they're getting in their current classroom instruction. But they're available to all students if turned on by the test planners. And just a couple examples there: answer masking, bilingual dictionary, native language translation. There's some really advanced kinds of things that are available in there. Color contrast features, and even some of the text-to-speech options are available as a designated feature as well. So that's the second tier. Then the third tier that they're using the terms actually accommodations. So really the universal and designated, they're aligned more with the term accessibility. How can we make the test accessible to every student based on our needs? Whereas accommodations is getting more into the idea of disability-based issues. So changes in procedures or alterations, and the goal there is, fair and equitable access for our kids that have disabilities. And so these features, also need to be indicated in the system, but they are only allowed for students that would have something similar guided by their IEP, 504 plan, or English learner plan has been included in there. So there's a few examples: speech to text for the written answers, use of the scribe. We know that there is a writing test on ISS. It's going to be kind of new territory for us in Iowa. So you can see obviously things like speech to text or a scribe are very much an accommodation. Slang language interpretation, use of Braille, online Spanish translators, those kinds of things are in that third tier. So I guess what we're recommending is, this is going to be new for everybody, but this information was shared with our broad group of special education teachers back in December. But just encourage you to be working with your special education teams on thinking through which of these kinds of things will our students need and benefit from. And the manual itself, notice it's called Accessibility and Accommodations Manual. It's a pretty good manual. It's very clear. There's a lot to it, but see, notice the visual here. Accommodations, smaller group of students, then we get designated and universal. So really trying to fit the scheme into kind of an MTSS type of a model. And then the manual goes on to, it gives very nice descriptions and even visuals of what the different features look like. It tells you over here kind of by visual code, does this one apply to the online version versus the paper pencil version? Shows you what the pop-up calculators will look like. And it just goes through and lists each and every one by these categories. So I'm still here in universal features. This is going to be available to anybody. All these features, and then we move into designated. And again, you see what things will look like. Even things like color contrast, it might be more. They might be more preferences for some students, but if a student had a true visual disability, contrast can be important for them. And then it goes on to that third tier of accommodations. All right, let me pause. Any thoughts or questions from the group out there about this? We want to we wanted to make sure this was on your radar screen, that, you know, your special education teachers and special education teams are going to be needing to think through this issue of accessibility and accommodations on the new test. I think there's a lot of really good, exciting features, but I know it'll be a matter of getting used to making it all work. But I think everybody's in good company. You know, as a state, we'll all be learning this as we do this first administration this spring. Okay, maybe no questions there. All right, very good. It's about 10 to 11. We even have a few minutes to spare here. As we wrap up, I would just well, let's look towards our next scheduled meeting is April 18th, morning and an afternoon meeting. Electronic as well. So if you would put that on your calendar, that would be great. There is a feedback survey. If you would mind taking a couple minutes just to give us some feedback on our meeting, our process today, that would be great. And really want to encourage you. We have two kind of question documents in here. So going back to our 4333, our graduation requirements. Angie put in this link here where it says questions. Please do add follow-up questions. I think this is an area where we're all going to have lots of questions, and would love to collect your questions here. And we can work with the DE to try to get clarity on some answers. And then also up here from our dyslexia presentation, also there's a link there for follow-up questions you may have, and we'll look at those, and we'll find a way to get some clarifications out to the group. Anything else for the good of the cause, or? If not, thanks everybody for being a part of our meeting today. Thanks for spending your Valentine's Day morning with us, and wish you a great rest of the day. Thanks everybody.